Our next speaker is Adrian Le Harivel, and he's the senior curator at the National Gallery of Ireland and has been involved with many exhibitions and publications. His special interest is in topographical art, including views and maps of Dublin. And his talk is dealing with can the past serve the present, in particular taking artists as a source for depicting Dublin squares.
I was slightly overwhelmed by such a large audience this morning. It's great to see such enthusiasm, which I shared when I came to this initially, because I thought there'd be hundreds of views by artists, it'd be a lovely survey, and then began to realize that, in fact, it was going to be more difficult than I expected, because artists depict many of the public buildings, the streets, individual houses. The squares and the whole sort of the context of the city has really become rather neglected, and often it sort of appears as like the side note. This is one of the celebrated series of Views of Dublin by James Moulton, which he made in 1791, and then he revised during the next decade, his father living in the city, before he produced his prints, which used to be everywhere, the most famous views of the city. And here you can see we are literally looking up towards where we are at the moment, just with the corner of the gardens and up to Palace Row. Even here, his rather oblique view means that the two key houses on the corner actually omitted where Finlay's church was built in 1863. So what I thought I'd do is to look at the big five, as we've been calling them, and I was going to apologise for using quite a few maps, but I see that actually everyone is finding them a very useful source, and they, of course, in themselves can be very decorative. John Rock's 1756 map we've already seen something of, and even that was produced with a certain swagger, as you can see. St Stephen's Green is our oldest square, and I have to say, developed painfully slowly, begun in the 17th century, and as early as 1670 it had acquired its double row of elms, wall and ditch. But the corporation did not seem to speed things on, and by 1728, in the very well-known little vignette from Charles Brooking's map of Dublin, you see certainly the outlines of the square itself, but the buildings coming on rather erratically, and an area that remained apparently wild enough that you could still go snipe shooting in the 18th century. There's been some question about what angle it is taken from, but the drawing in the National Maritime Museum by Bernard Gom, 1673, seems to confirm we're actually looking towards the west side, where the Royal College of Surgeons now dominates. Again with Moulton, and in his view we're on the Bowes Walk, which was how the north side of it became termed, and as you can see he provides suitable figurative accompaniment. The outside area survived to 1815, in fact, although one reads these constant accounts of having to dig out the dirt from the ditch, which actually became rather a hazard. And in the 19th century, finally, they put up pillars and railings. But what I'm particularly interested in, of course, is what's happening in the centre of the green, where it was decided to erect a suitable statue to George. This time it was the King George II by Van Nos the Younger. And you may have noted when we saw the detail of John Rock's map that it was shown there even 2 years before it was put in place in 1758. It wasn't just an equestrian statue, it had a massive base designed by Jarrett. And it dominated literally the whole of the green. And this is very extensive site. If you've walked it, you'll realise it's way beyond the size of a normal 18th century square. And all the paths literally converge on the centre feature. Even today, we still have this echo of the past in the central design of Stephen's Green. Here we are around 1900. I'm looking the other way. That's the Shelburne Hotel on the right-hand side. And again, giving sense, one looks in at other views. It was obviously a good era for photography. And by this stage, in fact, the border trees had grown a great deal and much thicker coverage. But the centre does seem to have had a certain sort of emptiness still to it. And we also have this rather strange occurrence that for such a large, you would think, civic area, it ended up still in private hands in the 19th century. This is something from our own collection. It's an aerial view that was made in 1846. About 1.5 meters wide, and issued free to readers of the Illustrated London News, the first of a series of the great capitals of Europe, which was quite an aspirational statement, given we're sadly at that time in the midst of the famine. Smith, who made it, we know nothing of, but he must have consulted both maps and one suspects possibly went up in a balloon. He does include an amazing amount of detail, right down to sort of figures in the streets. And although you might suspect that he would gloss over details, in fact, a lot of individual houses can still be made out. On the point of view of Stephen's Green, as we look down, this is the era when it had gone into the hands of a private committee. The key holders were well back and trying to keep the green going. This is a little watercolour. We're just at the corner of Kildare Street and the green on the north side, and rather charming, again in the National Gallery collection, by Thomas Badge, about 1808. And at the corner of the street there, you can just see a shop front with a typical glazed Regency front. And behind it, there's actually a viewing tower. The shop belonged to William Binns, who was an ironmonger, engraver, and also he sold toys and fancy goods. And the viewing platform was obviously an additional feature. I termed my talk a question of whether the past could serve the present in sort of good Maoist terms, ever aware that one has to find functions for buildings and for open spaces. And I think this is one feature perhaps we might bring back, the idea of a viewing platform so one could actually enjoy some of the squares and the more landscape features of central Dublin. It's not such a bad idea. The little view here was actually engraved the same year by Thomas Badge and helped, no doubt, publicise the shop, which there's, of course, no trace left. I said there were very few views of the squares, and so one hunts around, and here is the Royal College of Surgeons, and if you direct your eyes downwards, you can see just the edge of the green with the railings now in place, with people walking, sort of children playing, and bringing in the more informal landscaping of the 19th century. The story, though, of course, was in one sense only just beginning. We've had the first great book on St. Stephen's Green, but volume 2 is still to come, which will actually cover the period when Sir Arthur Guinness, later Lord Ardilaun, whose bronze statue is on the west side of the Green, comes into play, and in great act of philanthropy, buys out the key holders and not only just opens the green, but has it completely re-landscaped. And so what we now associate with it, the lakes and the walks, very much due to him, his architect James Franklin Fuller, and the landscapist William Shepherd. Following that, of course, the green continued to evolve. It became accepted as an open park for the public from 1880. Many of people, of course, just hurriedly rush by. And, of course, again, we have to mention artists in this context. Walter Osborne, the landscape and the painter of Dublin city life, had a studio on the north side of Stephen's Green and filled his sketchbooks often with little sort of studies which he might work up later. And here he is literally about to pass by the Shelburne Hotel, going down possibly towards the Royal Liberalian Academy or towards Merrion Square, but rather ignoring the green in this instance. The green itself began to acquire additional statues, and particularly into the 20th century. One thing it didn't ever get was a rather interesting scheme by Raymond McGrath, 1945, which would have been the Thomas Davis Memorial, right at the centre. Again, this interesting thing that even today, where you have a massive municipal flower bed and surrounding sculptures to various important Irish political figures, you still get this sense of the central focus of St Stephen's Green. Had McGrath had his designs accepted, possibly a little bit like a sort of Venice Biennale pavilion, rather nice, but in fact Thomas Davis, as you know, met his deserts on College Green in the sculpture there, which attracted a lot of abuse even in recent years and has now been cleaned up. And I have to say that the statue we saw briefly of George II only survived in 1937, day after the coronation of the more recent George. It was blown up, and one of several sculptures that has suffered removal fate, shall we say, with concentration today on the real, but of course there's also an unreal facet, and just as artists can often distort or change things, even map makers have their moments. John Rock again was ahead of himself when he put Bedford Square in place. If you crossed Essex Bridge, which was just about to be demolished, up the Parliament Street to the castle, it was intended to have, in fact, what would have been very much a continental piazza with a central statue of King George I in this instance, and also the other Van Nos. This is Van Nos' father, 1722. Well, they had the statue, which was on the bridge, a rather unusual location, and in fact decided not to proceed with the square, which would have been rather cramped. If you go up Dame Street towards Castle and Christchurch in the old area of the medieval city, it would not really have suited the space. Fortunately, what is a fine sculpture, laying one's royalist or other sympathies aside, ended up at the Barber Institute, where they bought it in 1937, possibly helped by the fact that their first director, Thomas Bodkin, had been director of the National Gallery here, and so he had a certain sympathy for things from Ireland, particularly what is a magnificent piece of sculpture. To my nearest home, of course, Merrion Square, and again with the Smith aerial view. This shows a square looking very much actually as it is today, though it has changed quite a lot. It's much smaller, about half the size of Stephen's Green, some 12 acres. And we know from the initial drawings, Jonathan Barker in 1762 made a drawing for the Fitzwilliam estate of showing a projection of what he planned the square might look like, and he puts in the double row of trees, obviously becoming a Dublin feature. This was, though, very much in private land, and what's amazing, the one key thing that's often forgotten about the evolution of Dublin is that the whole area from Merrion Square down to Merrion and even down to parts of Dundrum, westwards to Ringsend, was all part of the Fitzwilliam holdings, which then passed to the Pembrokes, and until 1930 was outside the control of Dublin corporations. It's the whole later Georgian down to the canal, then the Victorian development of Dublin actually is due to the private landowners. So in one instance we are imitating London, though they had no interest really in squares, and so they're actually lacking entirely on the south side of Dublin. But the Merrion Square obviously was there. 30 years it took to build the houses, so they weren't in really any hurry to deal with the square, which was only actually landscaped in 1791 as the scheme neared its end. Described in Wright's Historical Guide to the City of Dublin 1819 as thickly planted and luxuriant shrubbery. And as I was saying, the sort of figure of 8 paths you see here and in the detail are very much the same effect you get today, and also the outer edging of trees, although the planting is much more modern. And of course this links into more recent events because it passed into the hands of the Catholic Church, and since 1974 it's been leased on a peppercorn rent by the corporation, so hence it's become a public park quite late in the day. But the main feature it had in the 18th century, in fact, was the Rutland Fountain, which commemorated one of the most generous and bon viveur of Lord Lieutenants who died in office, it was said, from excess. And it was decided to put up this great monument to him. It had a practical purpose. The print you see here of it by Joseph Stadler from a John James Barrelay watercolour of 1787, again, well, like the map makers, he was ahead of his time because it wasn't actually finished till 1792, but it is accurate. And it shows at the centre a water nymph dispensing water, as the print says, to the poor of Dublin, though I have to say I really don't think they congregated in such numbers on Merrion Square, but we also had the lion's heads issuing water, a very sort of classical feature, and wonderful sculptural ornament from the Code Factory in Lambeth, South London, amazingly enduring, this artificial stone, even today in excellent condition. There was a moment in 2009 when all the ornaments suddenly disappeared. And fortunately, it wasn't a question of Dublin thievery. They were just being cleaned, and they are back again, as you can see. But we've lost the wonderful nymph in the middle, who would have been such a feature. The other reliefs relate to the Duke and his wife and his charity. Again, slight artistic license. You can't actually, from this angle, which is the same as you see the print, get the houses in the background. But obviously, it's planned as a central feature on the outside, of the park in order to be in a public space, and at that time just facing across to Leinster Lawn, not actually centrally on Leinster Lawn and Leinster House. Everything's got rather reconfigured with the 19th century museums, natural history and the National Gallery, but at that time it would have been a key feature there on the square. And just coming in, we've also lost the rather lovely railings. Another fact that railings tend to get removed, and of course in the 20th century even melted down for more practical, as people would see it, uses. But they had lovely examples there with spearheads in the 18th century, and this was the best lit of all the 18th century squares. The Stephen's Green was notorious for its muggers and for its bad lighting, but they made special efforts in Merrion Square in order to light it for the public. I wanted to mention Fitzwilliam, one of the last of the squares, only being completed around 1820. Could not find you a view, I have to say, so I'm cheating a little. This is Jack Yates' painting, A Morning in the City, 1937, and we're actually looking up Fitzwilliam Street. Right on the right-hand side there is the corner of Fitzwilliam Square, and in fact the artist's own studio, the outlines of which actually still survive in commercial premises, and in the middle Yates is striding down the street. You do get this sense of the bustle and the life of the street. Fitzwilliam Square is still only open to key holders and again has retained much of its appearance from the early 19th century. It's got a wonderful history, which I won't go into, except to point out two things. It also acquired tennis courts at one point, and in 1837 they banned croquet, which I thought was a interesting little vignette. Since we tend to be looking at the gentry and the well-off, a word for the working classes, and over on Queen Square off Great Brunswick Street, or if you prefer it, Pierce Square off Pierce Street, there's still a tiny little square of houses built just at the start of Queen Victoria's reign, hence Queen Square, which have a little park in the middle. It's not quite as formal as you see it here in the Smith View, but one of the little forgotten squares. Now, we've been seeing the views. This is John Rock and where we are at the moment, so we can rush brightly past, again, the Malton. They were issued in colour and black and white, his aquatints of the city, and bring you to a view. Now, I will apologise, but at the end of the day, you'll probably have had enough of James Mahony. It's just that we have in the gallery's collection this amazing watercolour, some 265 centimetres wide, 41.5 inches, that he made purportedly from the spire of St George's Church, which was intended actually to be put on Mountjoy Square, but never was, probably as well. And it was an era in the early 1850s when there was a liking for the spectacular watercolour. He also did a series of views of the Dublin Industrial Exhibition on the far side of the city. And what's amazing is that when you go into it, this we've had up already, the detail you can see, how greatly changed within 100 years Rutland, Acker Parnell Square had become a lovely detail of the boy playing with his hoop. And his eye for street detail, all the types of carriage, of porterage, of things going on as we move along towards Mountjoy Square, North Great George's Street, and then behind it, the secondary streets which play such a role in any Georgian city. And you can see, in fact, looks like a coach builder down there, and again, the amount of detail he records of how the city is being used and the unity, and bringing us to Mountjoy Square, with the wonderful view looking down, which again greatly changed. The new association, Mountjoy Square Society, have managed to get rid of the coaches and buses that used to park there. They came in down bringing commuters for the day, and I'm afraid a whole host of buses have now decamped to Merrion Square, where we have a new bus park. However, it's starting to go back to something of its greenness. It was quite carefully planned. So John Sutherland, a very important Irish landscape designer, actually was brought in to design the 4-acre park, and he put in serpentine walks and shrubs. We can't find a decent early view. It seems that it persisted on city maps actually beyond 1830, when it was made much more sort of relaxed, when people were allowed to be admitted on a charge. Residents still paying 5 guineas a year for a key in 1805. And they had 80 lamps to provide lighting, quite a small square, so again, nicely lit. And there was music, and later you got your tennis courts and other activities. Mahony records it without the marquee that used to be put up in the summer. Just of the details, nice to see some of the private gardens as well behind the houses, and also a wonderful piece of ironwork, the balcony at number 27 on the west hand, on the east side, on the left there, which is no longer there, but you can still see the places on the wall where it actually hung. Not a feature, again, suggesting we should bring back, but just sort of interesting to note the artist's record. And just coming in, rather proudly signed down there by James Mahony. he, again, must use maps. In fact, I was intrigued going further into the view. You can even find things like a vinegar works that he puts in the distance in the more industrial area around the port. I just don't think he went around and sketched everything. He would have used things like the 1849 city map, which is incredibly detailed and shows you a lot of buildings and features which are no longer with us. So I say, start optimistically, got a bit depressed, and then found that there is actually quite a lot you can read in artist images. But it is amazing that we have so few, really, of the squares and the overview of the city from the past. So they do need to be read with care to see exactly how attentive the artists have been as well. Thank you.